Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel, about Indian foreign policy, India's initiatives around the world to make it a better place, and also India's major strategic partnerships and rise in global affairs. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up the theme of technology, geopolitics, how these two are intertwined, and what this is doing to our emerging world order, what kind of global politics is emerging, and how India is positioning itself to handle these tectonic shifts. And to discuss this, viewers, let me introduce you to a specialist who is with me in the studio, Trisha Ray. Trisha Ray is a resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, major American think tank, and a long-time writer and thinker on issues where technology and geopolitics intersect. Trisha, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Trisha, everyone is talking about tech, big tech, and in many ways, what used to be a scientific community, hot topic has become probably the drawing room discussion for diplomats, military strategists, every average concerned citizen. Everyone's talking about tech, isn't it? And the way it has emerged on the global scene, it was obviously always determinant of the fates of rise and fall of powers and all those things historically. But something it seems to be in the present era multiplying those effects. Probably the speed of change. I was reading that the technological transformation of the next 10 years is going to be probably more than the cumulative changes of the last 100 years. And so it seems like it's really a high-speed revolution that's happening, and that's transforming everything, including diplomacy and foreign policy. So your thoughts on why this is happening and why technology has become so mainstream from what used to be just a scientific discipline?
Firstly, I am so glad that you mentioned that technology has always been a determiner of the fates of nations. In the past, wars were fought over different kinds of resources, but it was always about control over the flows of ideas, the flows of goods, and that continues to this day. And as you mentioned, what has changed is just the sheer volume. And now it's less about conquest and more about control over certain intangibles like intellectual property, innovation, research and development, skills, people. All of this matters more in this era. I'll lay out a few very simple facts, perhaps to contextualize this. We can think about just devices that we use in our day-to-day life, our phones, our laptops. Consumer electronics, we don't think of this as something like strategic really in our day-to-day life. But this year, the market for consumer electronics globally is $685 billion US. By 2028, it's going to be 1.15 trillion US. So there's going to be a massive growth.
Wow.
What goes into these devices? There's semiconductors, there's components, critical minerals. The control over all of this is going to be a determining factor in which countries control value in the next decade. We can also think about AI, which is a really hot topic at present, and Sam Altman visited India recently and really invigorated that debate in India as well. AI is powering our governments now, our economies, industry. You have Vladimir Putin said 3-4 years ago that the country that controls AI will rule the world.
Yes.
You had Elon Musk saying that AI is more dangerous than nuclear weapons. So AI is another area that is rising in prominence and is increasingly tied to the fates of nations. We can also think about flows again. The supply chains, which over the past few decades have moved towards efficiency, but that has also meant that there are a lot of choke points in the supply chains. There are certain countries that if they chose to shut off the supply of certain components could cripple entire industries and economies. And we've seen that factor also come
Like
to the
Taiwan
fore.
with the case of semiconductor, that's often spoken about.
Yes, exactly.
90% of high-end chips, they say, is manufactured in this small island, which is the topic of huge contestation
Yes.
by global powers.
And Taiwan is a very interesting example of a country that has become so prominent in technology in just a few decades. Most of the outsourcing from the United States went to Taiwan when US chip companies decided that they would become more design focused, and they moved all of the manufacturing out. It went to Taiwan, and they really capitalized on that, and now they're one of the most prominent players when we think of semiconductor technology. So that is also a very good demonstrator of the pace at which things can change in this space.
And Trisha, some people think of especially authoritarian leaders like Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin often talk about control. But even democratic countries, you hear a lot of public figures and world leaders saying that we have to master the core technologies and we have to have control over them, and we can't rely on anybody else, and we should invest heavily in this. And many countries have announced mega spending plans and investment plans to upgrade their technological capabilities and prowess. But there is also the view that big tech is out of control, and frankly it cannot be used in geopolitical games, because many of these companies have their own vested interests and are not necessarily amenable to nation states and their channeling in particular directions.
Whether big tech companies have become too big.
Yeah.
Are they too powerful now? And there is an argument that yes, in fact, in many spaces they are as influential as states, because the audiences of some of these platforms can be countries on their
They
own.
run into billions, yeah?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So they hold a lot of sway over public debate, which is so important to functioning democracies as well. The good thing is that companies still need to be headquartered somewhere. So they are still accountable at least to the governments of the countries they're headquartered in. Unfortunately, they're mostly headquartered in a couple of countries. The United States, of course, is one, and China, though India does not have this problem anymore, but China is the other country. So the platforms adhere to the political ideologies, priorities of these countries. Another interesting trend that's happening is that tech companies are playing into the geopolitical narratives that their home governments are proposing. So companies like Facebook, Microsoft, Meta, they will also talk about their role in the US-China tech competition. Perhaps as a marketing strategy, but they are also
to get incentives for taxes and other things, yeah.
Yes.
To be seen as national champions.
Exactly. Yeah. In the US case, it's the structure is a little different. It's more incentives based. In China, there's a very direct
They
relationship.
have to comply with the Communist Party's diktat. Yeah,
Yes.
So viewers, what Trisha is saying is that it's complex, but then states still do hold the reins on many issues, although technology companies are mega entities in themselves, and probably among the non-state actors that are influencing international relations today, there is no bigger category than tech and big tech companies. Viewers, focusing on the geopolitical competition, we've already talked about China-US rivalry, and that's a number one defining factor in the ongoing tech war and chip war and all sorts of things that have been talked about. I have a couple of interesting reports about the tit-for-tat maneuvers on technology between China and the US and its allies on the other side. Let's watch this and continue the discussion.
A US-led charge to make it harder for China to make advanced chips scored a big win on Friday. That as Japan became the latest country to align itself with US technology trade controls. It announced it would restrict exports of 23 types of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Japan said equipment makers would need to look for export permission for all regions, though it did not specify China as the target of the measures. Japanese Economy and Trade Minister Yasutoshi Nishimura said Japan wants to stop advanced tech being used for military purposes. The decision is seen as a major win for US President Joe Biden's administration. In October, it announced restrictions on China's access to US chip-making tech to slow its military and technological advances. Fellow chip technology heavyweight the Netherlands said earlier this month that it too would join the US in restricting exports. Japan's restrictions will be effective from July and cover 6 categories of equipment used in chip making. The country is a key producer of chip-related tech made by companies like Tokyo Electron and Nikon.
US-China trade tensions look to be escalating. First came news that Beijing was set to restrict exports of key metals used in chip making. Officials said that would cover some shipments of gallium and germanium products. Analysts said Monday's move was a response to US efforts to restrict Chinese access to some chips and related technologies. The news sent industry players scrambling to secure supplies of the critical metals. Then on Tuesday came news of Washington's possible next steps. The Wall Street Journal says the Biden administration is preparing to restrict Chinese access to US cloud computing services. If confirmed, that would likely require firms like Amazon and Microsoft to get permission before supplying some services to Chinese customers. The report says the move will come within weeks. Now the question is what might come next. Some in the tech industry fear China could respond with restrictions on the supply of rare earths. Those are specialized metals used in key tech like electric cars and military equipment. China is by far the biggest producer, giving it major power over supplies.
So viewers, you just saw 2 reports about China-US competition, how it's intensifying, especially in the technology sphere. And it's quite interesting that while there are many dimensions to the rivalry, like military and geopolitical and trade, technology has become the centerpiece of US-China competition and great power rivalry. And this is something we have been talking about in the show already. Coming back to Trisha, Trisha, we just saw the kind of intense tussle that's going on about control over core technologies and who gets access to what precious equipment and raw material and all these things. It's got a kind of like there's a bit of a mercantilist feel to this, as if we are in the 19th century or something like this. But it's that, like you said, the fight is over intangibles. And on that count, what do you think is happening now with this clear division between China and the US? China still has significant influence in terms of 5G and telecom and all these things worldwide, especially in developing countries, while the US is trying to deny China the advantages so that it catches up. And then the US is also fearful that all this high tech is being deployed by the Chinese to advance their military might. So do you think the Americans are finally, are they hitting the nail on the head insofar as what they need to do to stop China from catching up with them, which is tech? Is that like the crux of the matter? And looks like especially Biden administration, they have really honed in on this as a number one thing to tackle China.
Semiconductors is an interesting case study in the US-China competition. It really boils down to one question: what is the end state that the US is hoping to achieve in restricting Chinese access to technology? The US believes it is because China doesn't follow rules. So this is a way of restricting access to get them to behave more as a responsible player in the international system. The Chinese perceive it as the US just wants to destroy China. And that is also like a fundamental difference in worldview, which is why you see the two not agree on much. You also recently had a prominent hacking case of a Chinese cyber group hacking the emails of US State Department officials. So
Microsoft was providing.
Yes. So I think one of the key issues is that there's a lack of understanding of what the end state is on both sides. And because communication has also stalled a fair bit between US and China, that has also played into this. But the US sanctions are no joke. They are really restricting Chinese access, not just to semiconductors themselves, but the machinery and equipment required to make semiconductors. Because China, once the first set of sanctions hit under the Trump administration, they started buying up semiconductor manufacturing equipment so that they could produce domestically. The US has restricted that as well. It also, the sanctions are also applicable to countries that buy US equipment and maybe supplying to China. So those countries are also restricted through these new measures. They're fairly comprehensive. The cloud computing point that was mentioned in the Reuters report is also quite interesting, because that can also tie into quantum computing, which is another area of growing competition between the US and China. And how that ties in is, one, of course, there's the competition over who's going to make the first sustainable quantum computer. Right now, quantum computers, the ones that are being used in labs are hybrid. They're not purely quantum. And some of these companies provide these services over the cloud.
Right.
So by restricting cloud services, the US is also restricting Chinese access to any form of quantum computing. So that's another area in which this is happening. And then the final point is that all of these US measures will not work without partners. So Japan and Netherlands have, of course, joined the US sanctions on semiconductor equipment against China. Another country that viewers should also keep an eye on is South Korea, which is a country we don't often talk about when it comes to semiconductors, but Samsung is one of the biggest companies in this space.
It's the second biggest after Taiwan, isn't it, in manufacturing?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
right.
globally.
And they have a lot of facilities based in China. And the US State Department has made quite a few visits to pressure the South Koreans to join sanctions. Verdict is still out whether they will, because the China-South Korea relationship economically is really strong,
huge.
even if the security relationship is not as strong.
Right, so alliances are being lined up on this issue, and you are saying that it will take some kind of a big coalition actually to try and stop China's technological advancements. But on the question of the military, Trisha, everyone wants to know, China has moved, they say they first had the concept of informatization in their defense strategy and military talk. Now they are saying intelligentization of military and all that, and they're spending a lot, hundreds of billions of dollars. The second biggest defense budget on earth after the US is China's. So there also, do you think that that's one of the reasons why this has become a big national security issue? National security advisors and military chiefs and defense chiefs are all talking about tech. Is that why? Because they fear that there could be like a tilting of the scales, and that China could potentially equal the United States one day in the military domain, using all these advanced semiconductors, quantum computing, all these things, artificial intelligence. And what do you think is going to happen in the military sphere? Because that, of course, is very closely linked to the geopolitics.
And that's really the crux of the issue. A lot of the semiconductor debate, before it has kind of rolled into this broader commercial aspect, the crux of it was always military access to technologies. And that's what's also peculiar about the current era, where a lot of this tech is dual use. And so there is no clear delineation between military access to a certain technology and then commercial civilian access to the same technology. And that is, of course, one of the challenges. An interesting area we've seen this happening, like playing out in, has actually been in the current war in Ukraine, where we don't think about missiles and tanks as consumers of semiconductors, but they are. All of this equipment requires semiconductors to function, and Russia has lost a lot of equipment in this conflict, and they are right now getting around this by importing consumer electronics from Europe, refrigerators, just laptops, and using those semiconductors for military equipment. So there's a very clear physical evidence of the dual use of semiconductors.
So viewers, what Trisha is saying is that wars can be won or lost based on technological superiority, and that's always been the case, but especially in the current era. And you see that also in areas like space, for example. There's so much contention going on around space technology and launches and satellites and all these things, which are also, of course, very closely linked to semiconductors. But viewers, coming to India now, we are a rising power but technologically not yet at the level of the United States or China. So what are our options? Where are we going? And who can be our allies or major partners in technology as we go forward? I have very interesting comments by India's Information Technology Minister Ashwini Vaishnav on this matter. Let's hear him talk about this.
India's semiconductor mission is progressing at a very fast pace. Step by step, we are achieving new milestones. Today, a very important milestone has been achieved. Japan and India today signed a memorandum of cooperation for semiconductor development, manufacturing, research, design, and talent development. You are aware that we have had multiple rounds of discussions with the Japanese industry, with the Japanese government and Japanese academia, and today we have reached a decision where Minister Meiti from Japan, Ministry for Industry, Economy, Trade, and Nishimura-san, and our Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, we signed on behalf of the two governments a memorandum of cooperation. We'll be taking it forward through our industry to industry collaboration and also through government to government collaboration. As you are aware, everybody wants a resilient semiconductor supply chain, and in this India and Japan are very important partners, and this is in furtherance with our Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji's very successful state visit to US, where many agreements were signed, and that is reflecting in cooperation with other countries today.
So viewers, India's IT minister is saying that India's expanding strategic relationship with the United States is also creating spin-offs through further cooperation with US allies like Japan, and this is an important point to note. These are all interconnected nodes, so it's not just purely a bilateral thing between India and Japan. And we have, for example, the Quad grouping, and all of them have vowed to enhance technology cooperation among themselves as well, and Japan and India are core members of the Quad. So Trisha, it looks like Japan, we discussed earlier how it's trying to deny access to China on chip making, but on the other hand it's willing to share with India. So there's clear lineup there that's happening, and while we have a goal for self-reliance in these fields, it's obvious that these are areas where we do need a lot of global partners. And I think India is seems to be hitting the right notes here by entering into these kinds of cooperative agreements to co-develop and transfer and know-how in these fields. So your thoughts on our tech diplomacy, that we are seeing through these kinds of new critical emerging technology type agreements we are doing with the US and its allies?
Yes, India has emerged as a trusted partner of choice for a lot of countries that are looking to diversify away from China, but diversify in general as well. And that is in part due to India's very strong pool of talent, and also in part due to the trust in its institutions. There's a trust that the government is going to follow certain procedures, which doesn't exist when it comes to China. There is trust in the transparency and the processes here. That's one of the advantages that India has. It has also been very successful through partnerships like the Quad, positioning itself as a kind of third way almost. India is an interesting rising power because part of India's tech diplomacy relies on the fact that when it comes to tech competition, India always follows its national interest. And that is a position that resonates with many developing countries in the so-called global south, across Asia, across Africa, across Southeast Asia. And so beyond partnerships that it's forging with developed countries, It's also a leader in talking about the voice of developing countries, and we've seen that also in the G20 presidency, where it has brought a lot of these issues to the fore.
And sharing
as well.
technology with less developed countries.
Exactly. And
Frugal innovations and all those
frugal
things.
innovation, digital public infrastructure has been this new area of India's tech diplomacy as well. It's been a prominent part of the G20 agenda and under the Digital Economy Working Group. It's also made its way into the Quad statement. So the last Quad leader statement talked about the importance of digital public infrastructure. When it comes to the European Union, the EU-India Trade and Technology Council, their latest statement also talked about the importance of digital public infrastructure. So this DPI is also one of these exports that India has to offer when it comes to technologies.
So viewers, what Trisha is saying is not only military modernization and competition with other countries where India will rely on these emerging new technologies, but also to establish and consolidate its leadership of the global south, and that's a very important element of Indian foreign policy, voice of the global south, and many countries are looking up to India's technological innovations that are cost effective, and perhaps that is one area, as Trisha says, where India has an advantage, a relative advantage, because the production and dissemination of technology is a lot cheaper and more cost effective when it comes to India, more economical for developing countries, more affordable. China has also placed itself as a provider of affordable technology in the global south, but because of the competition with the US and because of a perceived Chinese neo-colonialism and resource exploitation in poorer countries, there is a question mark. So perhaps there is a space there that India could take and fill the void, especially in Africa and poorer parts of Asia and Latin America. So a lot to think about technology and geopolitics, and we have only just barely scratched the surface in this show, but time doesn't allow us to go further. I want to thank Trisha Ray for valuable insights. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Sreeram. It was a pleasure to be on this show.
Viewers, technology is the determinant factor. Karl Marx once said that it's not the articles, the implements and the weapons that are made, but how they are made and with what instruments they are made that define historical epochs. So let's focus on technology and the methods of production, to go to Marx, and how these are going to be determinant not just for balance of power in the world, but also for all our lives going forward. Who is powerful and who is not is ultimately going to be decided by technology and the ones who wield and who have access to technology. So India is aiming to be a powerful country, leading power in the world, and for that obviously we are going to rely on technology as a driving force going forward. Let's keep our eye on the technology ball. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.